Hi everyone. So I'm sorry, I totally just like looked over there and saw like a plane flying by with like a giant number 12 flag, so I got a little distracted by that. But yeah, it's like somewhere going around. This is an interesting day. So thank you all for like not being outside with that craziness right now. I really appreciate that. So yeah, I am a person who loves games, and does anyone here, like how many of you actually know about like gamification and stuff? Cool, so like can anyone sort of like describe to me what that means really quickly? Just anyone.
Me.
Sorry, good?
He's offering me up.
Oh,
so,
yeah.
Well, let's see here. I think it's taking something and putting in hooks that are game-like triggers to motivate people to do things, and making it a little bit more fun and positive rather than drudgery.
Yeah, cool. So yes, so a lot of people think of that and they think of like achievements and things like that. But there are a lot of other interesting parts of the game-making process that I think that people should sort of explore. So I'm going to sort of go through that in a little bit. But first, a little bit about myself. So as you said, I'm Catt Small, and I do a lot of stuff. So this is actually me at the New York Comic Con. It's pretty blurry, so you can't really see it, but you can see my strange cat face postcard that I love very much. I have been playing games since approximately the age of 3. So like when I learned to walk, I started playing games. And I started programming my own games when I was about 12 years old, and that led me into actually sort of designing websites so that I could actually host my games online. So I've always had this sort of like intersection between making games and making websites and user experiences. So I currently am a user experience designer and developer at Bedrock Media Ventures. I do a lot of designing in terms of content management systems at the moment, and some more user-facing stuff as well. I am also an event coordinator. I run a meetup called Tech Under 30, and we usually run an event once every month. And last month we actually had Lou Rosenfeld come in from Rosenfeld Media, and that was pretty sweet. So I also teach people to make games through the Code Liberation Foundation. We've been around for approximately, I would say, a little bit less than a year, and it's been a really interesting experience so far, and we teach women to program video games. And I also make my own games with a couple of different groups, so don't ask how I have any time. I clearly do not sleep. But I make games with Quantum Box, which is like a small collective. I'm also making an educational game with Buttered Toast Studios. And I'm making a mobile game currently with the Brooklyn Gamery. So user experience is a hybrid, and I'm sure a lot of you know this. This has been mentioned a couple of times today already. But how many of you actually came from another field and ended up in user experience? Yeah. So I did the same thing. As I mentioned, I was a web designer, and then I realized, hey, maybe there's more than just sort of, making something look good. Maybe it's also about how people are feeling when they're using this. So that sort of like, snowballed me into user experience. And Lou Rosenfeld actually said that the field is constantly evolving because people are always bringing something in from whatever field they were in before. So this is very true with me because I make games, so I constantly see things that would work very well, the practices that could work very well for user experience design as well. And I just thought this was really cute, so that's in there. So I'm assuming a lot of you play games. Is that correct? Or very awesome. Well, I hope that I show you a lot of games that you might be interested in playing. A lot of people think of achievements and leveling up when they think of gamification and making games. But in reality, a lot of making games is about strategy. It's about the mood that people are going to feel when they're playing this game. And it's a lot about controlling emotions, actually. So it's a lot more than just putting in badges and making people feel like they're accomplishing something. It's also about other things. So we'll run through a couple of these things that I hope you will find very interesting. So number one, when you're designing a game, it's very much about a balance between the complexity of a feature and the value that people will get from it. So what that basically means is if your feature is more useful than it is complex, then it's great. But if it's too confusing for them and they don't understand what they're doing, it's going to be more frustrating and they're not going to understand why it's there. So it's the difference between this vase and this vase here. And there are a lot of great games that master this very well because they sort of go through and see if something makes sense to be there or not, and it's very important. So if we put that into numbers, that would mean that you would want at least a 1-to-1 ratio of usefulness to complexity, and preferably way bigger. So one example of this is a game that I recently made with 2 other friends, and we made it for the Global Game Jam, which is a hackathon that is centered around making games. So we made a game called 5 Stages that's about the 5 stages of grief after a relationship ends, and the 3rd stage was bargaining. So we had the idea of telling the player things to do, and then they would actually get hurt if they did that, because in a relationship, when it's ending, you're sort of bargaining with people and you don't really want to do things because they hurt you, and it's really complicated. But it was so confusing for people because it was more complex than useful that they ended up getting really frustrated, and a lot of people stopped playing immediately. So what we did was we went in and we added little hint text in the title that said, disobey. So immediately, if they read the title text, they would see, oh, maybe I should not be doing what they're saying to do. And just to sort of underline that, we also put in this response text anytime you did what they wanted you to do. So it would say, yes, do exactly what I want you to do. And I wish it actually had that voice, but there was no voiceover. So yeah, it's really about breaking down these complex features and sort of seeing, do these matter, and are these more important than they are confusing? So this is a really big part of designing a game. And in terms of user experience and product design, it really sort of comes down to prioritizing things, seeing what you can sort of implement immediately that is going to be immediately helpful and get you to that goal. What are things that might be too confusing and not worth immediately putting in? And so, for example, at Bedrocket, we want to let users contribute content. So one thing we can do immediately to help the situation and get toward that point is to allow users to sign in without Facebook, because currently we're only Facebook. You can only sign in if you have Facebook, and that's not really going to be helpful in the future. Next, we need a content screening process, because if we let people go crazy, we're going to have a lot of trolls. And after that, we want to also be able to add a front-end user content management system so that they can go in and have a good experience and sort of just put content on there without being sort of like roadblocked. So it's sort of this idea of just cutting, listing out the feature, the parts of the feature, and then sort of slowly seeing what are the biggest parts, what are the parts with the most priority. Next is one of my favorite things. Being consistent across platforms. And games do this really well nowadays, at the very least, because they understand that no matter what someone's using, they're going to want to have the same experience. So, for example, this is back in the day, so this is a bad one. Sonic 2 is actually one of my favorite games, and it's the one that I started with, so I have like a lot of emotional attachment to it. I actually had 2 versions of the game. I had the version for the Genesis, which is the one that everyone probably knows about, and the other version is for the Game Gear, which is a handheld, and that it's actually a handheld from like the early 90s that takes like 8 batteries and only runs for about 2 hours, so you end up not even taking it outside. But I was really excited because I could play Sonic 2 while I was on the go, and I thought it was going to be the same game. Immediately when I turned it on, I realized it was a completely different game that had the same name, and it was pretty frustrating. So, you know, Tails isn't in the game. The graphics are completely different. It's just amazingly different, and they both have the same name. So this is a great example of what not to do. A game that does this really well and is really consistent is called Spelunky, and I love this game, and everyone should try it. So they actually have a Mac version, a PC version, an Xbox version, a PlayStation 3 version, and a handheld PlayStation Vita version, and all of them are the same, and they have all the same functionality. So this is something that you should strive for when you are making a product as well, because no matter where someone comes from, they should have the same experience and be able to do the same things. And we are committing to doing this with Prism Shell as well. So we have a version for Tizen, which is a new operating system that's coming out based on Android, and we are now porting it to Android, and we want to make sure that it has the same features. So we're going to try to list out the features that it has, make sure those are all consistent across the board, and also if we port this to iOS, we want to make sure we do the same thing. So this is really important because since 2011, more smartphones have sold than computers, which means that we are heading more toward a sort of mobile lifestyle, at least according to trends. So it's really important that when someone's commuting, they don't get interrupted and they can't do something they need to do because they are on a small phone. So people don't really care where they are. They still want to be able to do the same things. Next is playtesting production-ready code, like real builds. So this is a great game. It's called We Didn't Playtest That at All, and they actually really didn't. You can lose in one turn. So if you have $8, I suggest buying it because it's pretty great. But it's a great example of what not to do. So what this means, playtesting production-ready code, is that you want to test more than your prototypes. Because prototypes are really useful. They're really great for figuring out the initial usability issues and where you want to go and the direction you want to head in with your design. But at the same time, they do not allow you to sort of see how people are going to respond to the actual live build. And that's really important because in game design, there is a concept called game feel. And there's actually an entire book about this by Steve Swink. And it is about, how do I describe this? It's a really complex sort of feeling. And it's sort of comprised of several different things. And it includes like aesthetic, response time, and sort of the general tactility of a game. And it also sort of even extends to the feeling when a player is so involved that they're like moving around and like freaking out and like screaming at the television or the computer or whatever they're playing on because they're just so involved with the game. So game feel is really important, and it's even to the point where I think there could be something similar in user experience. Because it's very important in terms of response time and things like that. When you're using a product, all of that matters, and it also does in games. So this is a very dark photo of Chris Algu, who is another member of the Brooklyn Gamery, sort of just playtesting our game. And this is a real build, not a prototype, because we want to see more than just like how it looks. We also want to sort of go into seeing like, is this functioning correctly? Like, is anything slowing down? How are people reacting to it slowing down? And how do normal people use this instead of like a QA person, for example? And this is another dark photo of Buttered Toast Studios playtesting Al the Chemist. And the kids actually broke a ton of stuff, so it was really interesting and really funny. But they responded pretty positively to it, and obviously we found a lot of things we need to fix. So this is important because, as I said, your product should feel responsive, and not in terms of like the screen shifting, shape shifting, responsive design, but rather in terms of the feedback that it immediately gives you. Because feedback is really important. As Don said this morning, it's the thing that lets you know that something's working or not. So it's really important. So next is Easter eggs, and I love this image because it's really cool, and I wish I had that talent with Easter eggs. So Easter eggs are really relatable, and they give your product a human feel, and people do this really, really well in games because very often game developers don't end up in front of the people who are playing their games. So very often they will put in these little references to other games or to movies or books or anything that they feel like people who are playing their games will get. So it's a way of sort of connecting game players with game makers. And don't ask why there's a watch on there. I have no idea. The internet is weird. So, yeah, and also happy face. But, so it's a great way of game players connecting with game makers without being face-to-face. And obviously in UX, you really want to make sure you test your product. And I would also say you should test your game. But sometimes it's not physically possible for people, or like they're in a giant company and everyone can't do that. But it's a great way of sort of connecting. So one example of this is Sonic Generations. There's a lot of Sonic in my slides also. But so this is a game that came out about 2 years ago at this point, I think. And it's a homage of sorts to other Sonic games like the one I showed before. And one thing they included was these wanted posters. And these posters are actually references to characters from the old games. So what they did by putting these in here is they said, hey, we realize that some of these players, you've been around for a long time, we know who you are, we really appreciate that you're still playing our game. And people who actually know Knack the Weasel, for example, would like skate by that and say, oh my god, it's Knack the Weasel, this is great, I love you, Sega. So it just sort of like pulls out this emotional response immediately that doesn't happen so often in product design. And this is just another example from another game. So they reference a lot of older games in this, and this is an example of referencing other games rather than like other types of culture. But any type of Easter egg is pretty awesome. So yeah, your product has personality, and it doesn't matter if it's like a serious one or like a ridiculous crazy one, but it still has some kind of personality, and you can use Easter eggs to sort of show, hey, we understand who you are, and we just want to connect with you. A great example of this happening in the product design world is actually Google. So Google is known for many things. Some of them are evil, some of them are awesome, but this is the one that, this is one of them actually. You can actually search for a couple of different things and you get things like this. So if you search for Zerg Rush, which is a term from StarCraft, another game, you can actually see this happen. So basically the O's start coming down the page and like destroying the search results. So it's really cool, and it sort of shows that Google's pretty nerdy, and they just sort of enjoy throwing these things in here. Also, if you do a barrel roll, if you search for that, it's amazing. The screen like goes woo. So it's really fun. Another great one is Blackacre Brewing Company. So right here it says I am under 21, or you can pick I am 21 and older. So if you pick I am under 21, it actually takes you to this video meme, which is really cool, and it's kind of older now, but it's still pretty funny, and it's pretty entertaining. So they're sort of saying, hey, we know sometimes kids come on our site. That doesn't mean they still can't be entertained by something, even if they're not ordering alcohol. So yeah, it sort of creates this emotional bond, which is really important, especially because sometimes products sort of convey this expression of being like a robot. And it's really important to realize that, hey, even if it's, like a business type of software, there's still someone behind there. There's a bunch of people behind there making it. And this is a great way to sort of convey, again, this sort of feeling. So sort of tapping off of that, capitalizing on emotions. And games do this really well. One of the things that is a very common misconception about games, actually, is that they are supposed to be fun all the time, but there are a lot of games that are actually disproving this. Games are not about fun all the time. Some games are fun. Some are not fun. Some are about expressing feelings and so on and so forth. But no matter what, a good game always leaves you with a memorable feeling. So it's not really about fun all the time. As I said, it's really about being memorable and leaving a memorable emotion. A couple of games that do this really well. Number one is Dysphoria, which is by Anna Anthropy. And she basically outlines her experience of transitioning to being a woman. So even the title screen actually is really, it's sort of symbolic because it sort of shifts together in this way. And the whole game is really about sort of being different and trying to show other people who she is. So she's got like this one screen where people are like shooting words at her and she's trying to block them, and this other scene where she's walking through and people are calling her sir, but she really wants them to say ma'am, and so on and so forth. And the whole game just sort of gives off this feeling of wanting people to understand what she's going through. And that may not particularly be fun, but it's definitely a really memorable game. Another interesting game is Contrast. Contrast is really interesting because it sort of gives off this otherworldly feeling. It feels like you're basically in a carnival from the 1920s in space. So it's really cool because you're sort of like shifting through shadows and jumping off of shadows to get to different places and solve puzzles. So this is a great example of a game using everything that's involved. Like the sound is just, it sounds like a carnival. It looks like a carnival. It looks like just like every dramatic movie ever from like between the times of the 1920s and 1950s. It's really interesting and kind of nostalgic even. So they really achieved this very well. And this game is kind of fun, but it's also really interesting. And by the end, you're just sort of wondering what happened. And I think they did that very well. And also in Prism Shell, we're trying to aim for a lot of high intensity. So we do that by sort of encaging you in this one space and then allowing you to speed around and shift really quickly. So it's very much about feeling like you're sort of trapped in a way, and we sort of utilize that feeling to increase your heart rate and keep you going, and even to the point where people are like possibly screaming. And a company that does this really well in terms of user experience is MailChimp. I love them. I use them all the time, and they're great. And it gives that immediate feeling of like, oh, I love them. And that's because they aim to be like your best friend in a way that's friendly, trustworthy, honest. And they accomplish that in a lot of ways through like quotations that they use. All of their messaging feels really secure. And they just do a really good job of sort of like capitalizing on people's feelings in multiple ways, including Easter eggs. And I think they're really great. So, yeah, to review, balancing complexity with value is a game designer's one of their main goals. It's really important to make sure that your product is more valuable and meaningful than it is confusing. Creating a cohesive cross-platform system, because you never know when someone's going to need to adjust their settings or, delete something or change an address and so on and so forth. You really don't want to prohibit people from checking out from your service, for example, because they can't change their shipping address really quickly. So it's little things like that that really people notice when they're in a pinch. So that's very important. Playtesting production-ready builds, because you can't really see response times as much from a prototype, for example. Easter eggs, because people love them and they allow you to have a connection with people even if you're not in front of them. And capitalizing on emotions, because there is a human behind it, behind the product that you made, and by taking advantage of sort of by defining the feelings that you expect people to feel when they go to your service, you can sort of push toward that more and sort of build everything around that kind of feeling you want them to experience. So thank you, and does anyone have any questions? Yes, we'll start back there actually. Yes. Yeah. So as you saw, the Google one was pretty funny. Yeah. If you actually search on Google Images for Atari Breakout, that's another sort of product-related one. Yeah. Yeah. I mean. Yeah, I mean, it can be little things, even if it's like a little quote somewhere. Even something like that is like a cultural reference, and people who understand it can be like, I get you. So even little things like that are totally cool, or like movie quotes. It doesn't have to be like directly game related, as you saw. Some of them are meme related, like Do a Barrel Roll is more meme related, even though it stems from a game. And the other one about the beer buying website, that one was actually just an internet meme that people sort of caught on to. So yeah, it doesn't have to be a meme. It can just be anything that's like a cultural reference, actually.
Like a thought on that, like an Easter egg type of thing that I saw on the website, sharing or whatever. I don't know, it's not quite an Easter egg, but I can't remember what site it's from, some sort of architecture site, somebody's portfolio. There's like a very obscure button that you can really see or think of as a button. And I'm clicking at it, just kind of flip the color scheme.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Vogue. Yeah.
Out of the way, you have to see
Yeah.
like involve some curiosity.
Yes, totally.
But provide something that's also not useful but interactive.
Yeah, that's a great point. Actually, a lot of Easter eggs are also about like, sometimes they're about like feeling the accomplishment of finding them. I'm trying to think of what site it's on, but I think it's like Vogue UK or something. They have like a raptor on the page somewhere, and like if you can like find it or something, and it's pretty cool, and it like has different fashion senses and stuff. So it's got like different clothes on it. So there are lots of interesting, strange ways to sort of put things, like create little Easter eggs, and you can either hide them or you can like put them somewhere within stuff. It's just a really fun way to sort of add like a sense of curiosity and also connect with people on a different level. Yes, you had a question?
Yeah, it was more about creating a same experience across different platforms.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that in terms, the examples you showed sort of had similar interfaces.
Mm-hmm.
When you go from something from a mobile perspective to a desktop, you have a different interface.
Yeah.
You have different sensors involved.
Yeah.
How do you not create a watered down experience for everything, but still create a decent experience?
Totally. So it's, obviously you don't always have to have the same interface, and like sometimes things can like switch around slightly in terms of placement, but it's really about making sure that the features are consistent, because for example, a good example of this would be fab.com, which I love very much. So Fab is great because they allow you to change your shipping address on the website. They allow you to change it on the phone, on the tablet. One of the little frustrations is that you can't change it from your settings on your tablet or your phone, which is a little confusing. So they sort of fail at that part. But at the same time, they do succeed in including that feature across all interfaces that they control. So it's sometimes the interface does change, but it's really about making sure the features are there. And also one thing that you might want to also explore doing is, keeping them using the same way of getting there across each, how would I say this, across each device. So if you have, for example, again, Fab, if people can go into the settings and change their shipping address there, then on the phone they should also be able to do that, which they can't right now. So it's more about making sure people can get to do the same things that they can do on one platform on the other, and hopefully in similar ways.
So, sorry, just to expand. So then do you leave out some features that may work on one device and not on another? Say if you could use sensors in some fashion, it would be an advantage on a mobile device versus, say, on a larger screen, and you could have a more robust experience in that sense. Do you just leave those out?
Well, I mean, in that way, I would hope that it would be more clear. Like, I don't know if that's like a main feature, because if it was like a main feature, that might be unfortunate. People might be kind of sad that they can't use it on another thing. But if it's sort of like a, hey, cool, you're using like a phone, we're going to give you this one extra cool thing that you can do on there, sort of outlining that, hey, this is special just for this one thing, and it's not like a main feature, that's sort of a way to get around it. And also just sort of saying, hey, like on the web version, you can't do this here, but if you download our phone version or our tablet version, you can get this extra cool thing. Just making it really clear that it's not there because of specific reasons is another great way to sort of get around including certain cool extra features. Anyone else? Questions? Awesome. Cool, yeah, it's like 12:48 now, so I think that's good time. Any thanks? Yeah.